I watched 1917 in the cinema 9 times. I've never done that with a movie before. I rarely get an urge to see a film again so soon after I've seen it for the first time, and have almost never seen a movie twice in the theatre. There's something about repetition that scares me. I'm afraid of getting trapped in never-ending loops, like the games my mind would play on me whenever I was running a fever as a child. And I used to scoff at other people who'd go back to the theatre over and over to watch some overhyped blockbuster like Titanic or Avatar. It struck me as silly and slightly obsessive. But there was just something about 1917. Sam Mendes' 8th film features George Mackay and Dean Charles Chapman as Schofield and Blake, British soldiers in the First World War charged with a desperate and vital mission to cross no man's land and deliver a message that will prevent the slaughter of 1,600 men, including Blake's own brother. My mum and I have regular mum and son movie dates, and 1917 was first on our list for 2020 after we saw the trailer. We respected Mendes and were fans of Mackay from his work on The Secret of Marrowbone. What have you done? And the Stephen King TV adaptation 221163.
My sister Clara, the one Frank Dunning killed. If you can go to other times, bring her back.
He has a veneer of intense stillness and self-control, but beneath it lies a raw emotional availability that's always evident in his eyes. And 1917 is all about seeing through George Mackay's eyes. The film, famously, is constructed to appear as one almost continuous shot, broken only by Schofield being rendered unconscious halfway through. It's compellingly subjective. You literally are following the men in their footsteps, only able to see what they can see, afraid of what they will encounter around the next bend of an eerily abandoned trench or derelict farmhouse. As a regular player of so-called walking simulation games like Red Dead Redemption 2, I was immediately struck by the similarity between such games and the experience of watching the film, with one crucial difference. I couldn't control Blake and Schofield. I couldn't make them stop. All I could do was hope that things would work out for them. The sense of empathy and powerlessness was immediate and palpable. On first viewing, the film was thrilling and the finale cathartic, and my mother and I were both suitably impressed with it. That first screening was subtitled, thanks to a screw-up by our local cinema on the pre-orders. My father's profoundly deaf, so I'm accustomed to watching films with closed captioning, but when there wasn't another enticing release for our next trip to the cinema, I half-jokingly suggested to Mum that we go see 1917 again without subtitles to see if it made a difference. She agreed. I was keen to see whether the film's single-shot technique was a gimmick that diminished the film's impact with multiple viewings, like the found footage approach used in the Blair Witch Project. Was it purely experiential cinema, a roller coaster ride that would lose its thrills as you became familiar with every twist in its course? After another 2 hours in the trenches, I discovered it wasn't. I found that knowing the outcome deepened my emotional connection with the film. It became fatalistic. Parts of it brought me to tears. A week later, we found ourselves wanting to see it again, and thus began our 9-week-long love affair with Blake and Schofield's Odyssey. Repetition is very much a part of the fabric of the film. It begins and ends with variations of the same shot, of Schofield asleep beneath a tree. The circularity almost invites repeated viewings. The film could play on an endless loop in which Schofield is trapped in a purgatory nightmare, doomed to repeat the same mission in an eternal test of his seemingly unshakable resolve. And it is his resolve that makes the film so compelling. Schofield is determined to get to his destination and prevent the meaningless deaths of his comrades. It's surely no mistake that his first name is revealed to be Will.
William Schofield. Will.
He is the embodiment of will.
You'll never make it,
says one soldier when he learns of Schofield's mission. Our hero turns to face him unwaveringly and simply replies,
Yes, I will.
Not I must, or I have to. I will. Schofield won't contemplate any alternative. His final lateral run across the line of fire, dodging hundreds of charging soldiers, is not an act of desperation, it's an act of determination. He will make it, and you are willing him to do it, breathlessly, every time. John Keats coined the term egotistical sublime in 1818 to describe, unfavourably, William Wordsworth's subjectivity in his poetry. Wordsworth, he felt, was unable to present the world as it is, only as he perceived it. His experience of a situation becomes part of what we see, part of the poem itself. 1917 contains a purely sublime cinematic sequence that's also an example of the egotistical sublime. It comes at that midpoint, after Schofield is rendered unconscious by falling backwards down a flight of stairs in a derelict building. The world goes dark and silent for an uncomfortably long time. I could feel it in the theatre with every audience I shared the moment with. Our hero awakes to a world transformed by night. As he stumbles, disoriented, out of the building, the camera flies through an open first-floor window to reveal a nightmarish chiaroscuro landscape where flares arcing overhead cast mile-long shadows among the denuded bones of the town. Schofield wanders into frame and, under enemy fire, begins to run through this alien landscape as the shadows shift rapidly beneath his feet. All the while, Thomas Newman's score traverses the full range of Schofield's experience, from a kind of terrified awe through heart-rending desperation to finally a renewed sense of purpose, as crucially our point of view shifts from behind him to in front of him as he strides towards us in the foreground rather than fleeing his hunters in the distance. The scene is electrifying. The first time I saw it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, or that the sequence kept getting more and more astonishing and emotionally resonant as it progressed. It is pure cinema at its finest, music and light, but crucially, it marks a shift into the egotistical sublime. We are no longer seeing the world as it is, but as Schofield is experiencing it. The darkness is a no man's land we cross into his exhausted, delirious point of view. I would anticipate the coming of this scene on every subsequent visit. I could feel the hairs standing up on the back of my neck as I anticipated its arrival, and it never lost its ability to overwhelm me. On subsequent visits, I enjoyed entertaining alternative interpretations of the story. On one occasion, I decided that Schofield had died in that building, and the rest of the film is a purgatorial fever dream. The subjectivity and surreal imagery support this. The church burning in a wall of flame, the river of corpses, which could all be duplicates of his fallen comrade if you squint at the screen. The oasis of soldiers enraptured by an angelic solo voice in a cathedral of trees. The movement between incidents often has a dreamlike logic to it. In a scene where Schofield discovers a Frenchwoman living secretly in the ruins, there is a moment of tenderness between them as she tends his wounds and he thanks her. The lingering look between them would, in a lesser film, have ended in a kiss. There is no sign of that here, just a shared moment of gratitude and humanity.
Thank you.
But it might remind Schofield of the wife and family waiting for him at home. As soon as thoughts of love and home possibly enter his mind, the moment is interrupted by the cry of a child. And the camera turns to reveal a baby squirming in its makeshift bed in an open drawer. A drawer, I noticed on subsequent viewings, appears to be empty when Schofield first enters the room. Did the thought of family conjure the child in the soldier's nightmare? In this sitting and reading of the film, it certainly seemed so. After completing his recitation of Edward Lear's fatalistic nonsense rhyme, The Jumblies,
They went to sea in a sieve, they did.
which he uses to soothe the child, there is a grace note of silence. And then a bell tolls. Schofield's fate is calling. He must continue his quest. It's also poetically perfect. It feels like a dream. Schofield's dream. Multiple viewings afford you opportunities to play games with a film. On one occasion, I decided to deliberately watch the character I wasn't supposed to be looking at, the actor in the background or the one receiving a line rather than the one speaking it. This gave a newfound appreciation for the actor's craft. They never stop performing, even when they know the focus of the scene isn't on them. They're always listening and reacting to what they're hearing. In the case of a great actor like George Mackay, you can see what he thinks and feels about what he's hearing too. It was on this viewing that I caught one of his best scenes in the film, a performance I'd never even noticed before. After witnessing the death of his brother-in-arms, Schofield catches a lift on a truck full of British soldiers. The ensuing scene features a lot of busy chatter between the other men as they share funny stories and perform mocking impressions of their commanding officer. On my first viewings, I would always be drawn into their conversation and watch each of the men as they spoke and laughed. This time, I watched Schofield, and I saw him quietly falling apart, struggling to maintain his composure while he grieves for his friend and to suppress his guilt at leaving the place where his body lies. When he finally meets Blake's brother, one of the first things Schofield mentions when remembering his friend is that he was always telling funny stories.
He was a good man. Always telling funny stories.
And here he is in a truck, surrounded by men telling funny stories, each reminding him of the brother-in-arms he's left behind. Schofield's silent anguish is crushing, and it's hidden in plain sight because no one is looking at him, and neither was I, until now. 1917 debuted in Screen 1 of my local multiplex, the largest screen accommodating the full width of Roger Deakins' cinematography without compromising on vertical height, and the loudest sound system. It stayed there for 4 weeks or so, and then, as other releases jostled for attention, was gently demoted to the slightly smaller Screen 2, and finally the decidedly disappointing Screen 3. My mum and I stuck with it as it weathered this indignity, this loss of fortunes. It became like a solemn Sunday service, a remembrance to the fallen. As the weeks went by, we began to recognize fellow faithfuls who were returning to commune with Schofield. After 4 or 5 weeks, it became unthinkable that we would watch anything else. On the rare occasions when something competed for our attention, we would stock up provisions and go for a double bill, always ending with 1917, always saving the best for last. To our great surprise, 1917 returned to Screen 1 on the 9th week of its release. We couldn't believe our luck. We returned once more and savoured every moment of this best possible presentation in our local theatre's grandest auditorium. We sat in humbled silence as the credits ran until the last note of Thomas Newman's gorgeous theme faded. Alone in the theatre, we stood up and bid a sad farewell to George Mackay, to brave, resilient Schofield, to this beautiful, uplifting experience, because we were certain it would be gone the next week. What we didn't know was that cinemas would be gone the next week, that the whole world would be in lockdown as we fought a silent battle against our own unseen enemy. We didn't know we were saying goodbye to our mum and son movie dates, to the indefinable thrill of sitting in the dark with a room full of people and being transported together to a different time and place, and watching tales of heroism and resilience. Now we have to show our own indefatigable resolve, find our own inner will. I watched 1917 in the cinema 9 times with my mum. I hope it isn't the last thing we see together.